Hello, fellow grave crawlers, and welcome to ZTV Reviews. I am Paper Zombie, your host with you as always. And on today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the 2019 four-part series titled Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. Since this special was a beast, with each part being an hour long, I'm going to break this review up into 3 episodes, with each chronicling a different phase in the Reconstruction process. If this is history you don't know about, I hope you find these 3 episodes informative. I found out Reconstruction was even a thing because I watched this special. None of my history classes ever talked about this period in time, and I get the feeling it's probably still like that today. Which is a shame, because Reconstruction is one of those things that needs to be taught and needs to be known, especially if you're African American. So since we have a lot to cover, let's go ahead and dive into part 1. Our first hour begins at the end of the Civil War on April 9, 1865, as Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. We learn that Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, was a government concept that was meant to deal with the reintegrating of the former Confederate states into the U.S., the destruction of slavery in the U.S., and what the status of the 4 million former slaves would be as a free people in the U.S. And let me tell you, it starts off rough. When then President Abraham Lincoln spoke to the public about Reconstruction for the first time, he suggested that some black men, being very intelligent, and black veterans, deserved the right to vote. A man in attendance turned to his companion and said to President Lincoln, "That'll be the last speech he'll ever make." And on April 14th, 1865, the man who made that comment, John Wilkes Booth, assassinated President Lincoln. 2 things happened after this. In May of 1865, Major General Oliver Howard was named the head of a new government agency called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. The Freedmen Bureau's purpose was to protect African Americans from violence, give them access to education, land, and make sure that the local courts treated them fairly. To help with land ownership, the Freedmen's Bureau was allowed access to the over 850,000 acres of southern land that was under the ownership of the federal government. So at the end of July 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau began renting out 40-acre plots of land to African Americans and gave them the option to buy the land over a 3-year period. If you've ever heard the term 40 acres and a mule, this is where that comes from. The second thing that happened was that Vice President Andrew Johnson took over as president. And while Congress was on recess, this one thought that he could single-handedly take care of Reconstruction and have it done by the time Congress came back from recess. Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction plan basically just gave amnesty to the white Southerners who would come in and take an oath to the Union and accept that slavery and that way of life had ended. And guess who shows up to get in on this? Many of the former Confederates who had taken the Southern states out of the Union in the first place. You see, getting their pardon allowed them to step back into American society as if they'd done no wrong. They were able to vote again. If they were in Congress, they were able to retake their seats. And if they were governors, they could make whatever laws they wanted for their states. But that's not all. In September of 1865, President Johnson ordered General Howard to give back almost all of the land that the Freedmen Bureaus had access to to the former Confederates that he'd pardoned. So 40 acres and a mule? Gone bye-bye. And if the African American hadn't bought their land, it was gone too. But it didn't stop there. In November of 1865, the government that President Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that applied only to African Americans that would become known as the Black Codes. The purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery had been abolished, but to make sure that there was as little change from slavery to freedom as possible for African Americans. Other Southern states would soon follow suit and adopt these laws themselves. And in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan would be created in Tennessee to assist with enforcement. By creating what were dubbed vagrancy laws, the Black Codes forced every Southern African American adult to sign a labor contract for a year with a white employer. So no more slave master now, it's employer. If an African American adult didn't sign, they would be considered a vagrant and they would be fined. If they couldn't pay their fine, they would be auctioned off to a white employer who would pay the fine. The African American adult would then have to work off that fine for the employer who paid. And who's to say just how long they would have to work until the employer felt that fine was paid? Even Southern African American children weren't safe. The planter class, which had formerly been a major user of slave labor, came up with the idea of apprenticeships. This literally let planters get legal and go to the courts and say that their African American neighbors were poor and couldn't afford to take care of their children. But they could. They could train both genders in farming and also train the girls in housewifery. Payment for this will go to the African American parents at the end of the year term. Now this sounds like a good, honest thing, right? Wrong. For starters, the planters didn't even have to prove that the African American family was poor and unable to support their children. All the planter had to do was just be better off than the African American family. African American parents also could not legally stop their children from being taken through apprenticeships. So this led to many children being straight up stolen from their parents. Fortunately, U.S. Congress became aware of the Black Codes. During this time, the Democratic Party was the party that supported slavery and opposed the civil rights reforms of the American Civil War. It was the Republican Party that was the party of the African Americans, as it was the one that was about civil rights and promoting a vision of interracial democracy. They were the majority party in U.S. Congress at the time. And in June of 1866, it allowed them to introduce the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment stated that anyone born in the U.S. would automatically be granted citizenship, and no state could deny to any person due process and equal protection of the laws. It meant that many African Americans would become U.S. citizens. And as U.S. citizens, many African American men would have the right to vote. Except for Tennessee, all of the other southern states, which is Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North and South Carolina, and Virginia, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. So in spring of 1867, U.S. Congress set out to reorganize the South. They established all of the southern states, minus Tennessee, into 5 military districts, with each one being overseen by a U.S. general. This was called military Reconstruction. and it meant that U.S. Congress had full power and authority over the Southern states' law enforcement. This meant that the Southern states had to work by the rules of the federal government instead of their own state laws and black codes. And it also meant that they had to elect new state governments and ratify the 14th Amendment. If the Southern states complied with the military Reconstruction, U.S. Congress would once again recognize their state representatives in Congress, whom hadn't been recognized since their pardoned reinduction. And that was the reason why the non-compliant Southern states chose to comply. African American men took the new right to vote very seriously. At the beginning of 1867, fewer than 1% of African American men in the United States could vote. By the end of 1867, that figure was higher than 80%. It would be this new voting power that would assist in Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant becoming President of the United States. This new voting power also allowed dozens of African American men to get elected to office. And this is where part 1 leaves us, on a high and bright note. But in part 2, we'll see if that high note stays high, or if it shows us just how low it can go.